Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to work with the 5 tribes of Idaho, both collectively and individually, over the last 20 years. I think it was 20 years ago this year that Mike Denoto and I were approached by the Nez Perce tribe to do an economic impact assessment on their newly established casino and their overall tribal operations. And I've just had a blast ever since. Over those 20 years, I've done an impact assessment individually and with repeated updates for all 5 tribes of Idaho individually. And I've done 3 statewide studies, of which the most recent is the focus of this presentation. I'd like to start out that one of the things that's so much fun about doing tribal studies is that when I get in to actually look at the numbers, I always think I have to be a 0 off. The numbers are so big. That pleasant surprise occurred in this study as it has in all the previous studies. Each of the individual tribes are ranked within the top 3 employers of their own regional economies. And I got to say in the outset, ranking employers or entities is tricky because there's no official measure and there's various measures of employment and there's subcontractors and all of those caveats. But with those in mind, the Kootenai tribe is the #1 employer in their regional economy. The Coeur d'Alene tribe is #2 behind Kootenai Medical Center. The Nez Perce tribe, depending on how you measure it, is either 2nd or 3rd. The Shoshone-Bannock tribes is #3, but only because the broader economy is so big. And the Shoshone-Paiute is either #1 or #2. So each of the individual tribes or important sources of employment, jobs and income, and frankly tax payments to the surrounding local economies, often with those local economies and the people there oblivious to the impacts of a local tribe. They don't realize that right next door they've got an economic powerhouse that's contributing a huge amount of influence and impacts to their local economy. This study was sponsored by the 5 tribes of Idaho. It was completed in January 2015. And this comes on top of doing individual tribal studies for each of the 5 tribes in Idaho. And the results and findings of this study, of course, are mine and do not necessarily represent that of the University of Idaho or any other individuals. So. Just a brief bio. I'm a lifelong resident of Idaho, originally from Lewiston, Idaho, so I haven't gone very far away. I'm a regional economist, and I've conducted over 100 economic impact studies in almost every industry in Idaho over my career. And in that career, I've done probably at least 20 tribal studies, including all of the updates over those years. Okay. So these are the 2 previous statewide studies. The first one was done in 2001. It was completed in 2002, but it was the data year 2001 with Mike Denoto, who has since retired. And then I did an update in 2010 for the 5 tribes of Idaho, and then the recent update. And this is an overview of the 5 tribes of Idaho and their contact information. And by the way, there's a handout up here with all of these impacts. Feel free to get one if you haven't got one already. In total, the 5 tribes of Idaho own over just under 1 million acres. And by the way, that's not the reservation boundaries or their historic boundaries. That's the actual amount of land they either hold in fee simple or in tribal trust. If the 5 tribes of Idaho were combined together, they would be ranked 20th if they were counted as a county. And by the way, their economic impacts would be ranked about similarly as well. If you put all 5 tribes together and ranked them as a county economy, they would be just about the same ranking. The tribes have over 150,000 acres in cultivation, and I think that's a low number. And they produce what I estimate revenues and expenditures of $100 million annually, and so they're agriculture powerhouses as one of their many attributes. Native American tribes in the U.S. Have a very long and unique jurisdiction status. They are sovereign nations. In actual operations, they have characteristics of both federal and state governments. Tribes have a governmental jurisdiction and an authority associated with that status. And like all governments, Native American tribes have profound impacts on the economic, social, and political effects on the geographic region and the sphere under their sphere of influence. Okay. The 5 tribes of Idaho, to put this in a brief conclusion, have an important and rapidly growing economic impact on the economy of the state of Idaho, often overlooked by policymakers and local residents, both. Many people don't realize the breadth and depth of activities of the tribes of Idaho. They have their own tribal governments, and that includes health and education services, police force, judicial systems, economic development projects, a huge array of environmental and fisheries activities, gaming, casinos and resort, agricultural operations, retail trade and service businesses, cultural and social functions, and a whole array of other regulatory and economic activities. And then combined, the tribes have a significant economic and social impact of the tribes. I think originally when the Nez Perce tribe approached us to do the first study, I think the emphasis was for us to take a look at their new casino. But what I found fascinating, the casinos are simply the icing on the cake. The cake itself is their whole array of other economic activities, which have profound economic influence in the state of Idaho. This is the sources of tribal funds, and then this shows the uses of tribal funds. From the federal government, they have an array of grants, contracts, and settlement. The tribal enterprises are growing and increasingly growing. An important function of the tribes is an important source of revenues, and then finally gaming. And then the uses of funds, and this, by the way, is not a complete list or an exhaustive list in any case, includes their tribal government, human resource development, which includes their wellness centers, their schools, their job trainings, their cultural enhancement, their higher education scholarships. Some of that money, by the way, and students come to us up here. Economic development, tribal enterprises, industrial and technology parks, community infrastructure. Several of the tribes are implementing high-speed internet, and a whole array of other economic development activities. They provide funding to local school districts. They provide community infrastructure and industrial parks. All of the tribes have long-term strategic plans for future expansion of economic growth. So it is an amazing array of activities. And one of the things I want to point out is where these activities are mostly taking place are in some of the most rural parts of the state and some of the most impoverished. So where their activities are taking place are where in Idaho it is most needed. The economic contributions include economic diversification in Idaho's rural and urban economies, and that diversification is extremely important, especially with the changing economic landscape in the state of Idaho as we move away from natural resource-based industries into more tourist and high technology and service industries. What many people in the communities around the state don't realize is right next door is a huge stabilizing economic force that has made that transition much easier, the Nez Perce tribe being a notable part of that. They provide rural economic development. They reduce unemployment both for tribal and non-tribal members, and they form important partnerships with local and regional economic development agencies and local businesses, and they also attract and enhance new entrepreneurs to Idaho's rural economies. This is my estimation of the direct tribal employment. These are the actual employees hired by the tribes or by one of their subsidiaries. And I estimate that the 5 tribes directly employ 4,641 jobs. And the vast majority of these are living wage jobs, so just under 5,000 direct jobs are directly employed by the tribe. And then through their other activities, they directly employ another nearly 2,000 workers. The casinos and related operations employ about 1,900 workers. Tribal enterprises, 146 workers. Housing operations, 84. Health clinics, 523 workers. You can just see the breadth of activity that they're engaged in. Okay. In addition, through grants and contracts, construction, agriculture, the hospitality industry, and service employment, they employ another 2,720. So the total amount of direct employment by the 5 tribes of Idaho, I estimated about 7,361 jobs. In Idaho, that's an astonishing amount of jobs. So, yeah. And that does not include any multiplier effects. This is the gaming and hospitality industry, which is an important function of the 5 tribes of Idaho. They have just under 5,000 video gaming machines. They now have 506 available hotel rooms. The gross gaming revenues going through the casinos is just under $1 billion a year. And $1 billion in Idaho is a lot of money. And I've got, many years ago, I was at a Lewiston chamber meeting of some sort. And at that time, the newly fledgling casino of the Clearwater River Casino was basically an inflated building held up by air pressure being blown into the building. And there had been a power glitch and the backup systems hadn't worked right and the roof had caved in, right? And some of the businessmen thought that was kind of funny, you know, and so they were kind of joking about it. Now I says, you do realize that there's $50 million a year going through that building. And most of that activity is coming right here to Lewiston, to the local businesses, and the tax revenue off that's coming to the local Nez Perce County, and that every day that building is not operation, that's a loss of money directly to you, and that got their attention. So it's just an astonishing, like I said, it's just an astonishing array of economic activities. Total combined unique visitors, this is hard to determine, but I think they likely exceed 500,000 visits a year from unique visitors. And I estimate that about 60% of those are from out of state, bringing new monies into Idaho, and I think that's conservative. Because when you get down and actually look at the visitors, there's two things you got to look at. One is the visitors coming from out of the state to visit the casinos, and then you got to look at the people in Idaho that would have left Idaho and gone elsewhere in the absence of the casino. So I think it may be as high as 70% or even higher than that. So, and most of this is new money to Idaho. If you count just the visit hours, it may reach as high as 12 million annually. Yeah, so just an astonishing big number. By the way, the population of Idaho is about 1.6 million. Put that in context. These are the casino locations in Idaho. Bonners Ferry, Coeur d'Alene, Nez Perce has one at Lewiston, or just outside of Lewiston, and one at Kamei. The Shoshone-Bannocks have 3. Fort Hall, the Sage Hill Travel and Center and Casino, and then the Shoshone-Bannock Peak Casino. So pretty well distributed throughout the state. I developed, I have community economic models for each of the 5 tribes in Idaho. They're in-plan models, and I also have a statewide model as well, and I used both of those in order to carry out the economic impacts of those. And by the way, almost all of the money, all of the sources of revenue, nearly all the sources of revenue for the tribes is certainly from a regional perspective, almost all of it's out of region. And from a statewide, almost all of it's out of state. And so it's, most of it is, the vast majority of it's new money to Idaho, or new money to the regional economies. And so most of the activity is new money to Idaho, and then through my modeling process, created economic multipliers by which to estimate the economic impacts. Okay. So this is the economic impacts. This includes the multiplier effects. It's about $1.1 billion in sales transactions. Out of that comes gross state product, which is about $653 million, which adds about 1% to Idaho's gross state product. To put this another way, if the 5 tribes of Idaho were plucked off the map, the state of Idaho's economy, the GSP, would shrink by 1%, which doesn't sound like much, but it's a lot of money. Yeah. It'd be enough of a shrinkage to put Idaho in a serious recession. Total wages and salaries, that's totally fully loaded compensation, including fringe benefits, is $479 million. And then the total jobs impact, including the multiplier effects, is 13,840. And that puts them in ranking of being within the top 10 employers in Idaho. Okay. There's a myth that, and it is a myth, that the tribes don't contribute to Idaho's tax coffers. They do. Anytime you have an entity generating large amounts of economic activity, it generates along with it large amounts of tax revenues. These tax numbers, by the way, were carefully adjusted. The tribes are exempt from some taxes for activities that occur directly on the reservation, and I overly compensated to make sure that that was fully in account. So these are very conservative numbers. So these are the contribution to tax revenue, to the tax coffers of the state of Idaho. Locally, they add just under $10 million in property taxes. They add just under $20 million in sales and excise taxes to the state, $10 million in personal corporate income, mostly personal income taxes, for a grand total of $39 million in taxes annually. And so they're an important contribution to Idaho's tax base, particularly for local economies. And if you've got a copy of the folder, that's hard to see, but you've got a copy in the handout that's there, has it broke out by industry. And you can get a sense of the magnitude, and these include the multiplier effects. So, and it gives you a sense of the breadth of the activities of the tribes. Okay. I did a comparison with my 2001 study to see what the growth between the two studies are, and there's a huge amount of caveats. There's a huge amount of caveats when you do this kind of analysis. Input-output models aren't really designed for time series, that is comparing across time periods. We have much better data today than we did in 2001, but still I think the magnitude of the numbers tell a story here. I adjusted the numbers in the 2002 study, adjusted them for inflation and put them in 2014 dollars. But at that time, in today's dollars, it would have been about $640 million in sales transactions. The total compensation was about $213 million, and it was about 7,374 jobs. So the job increase between the two studies is nearly 88% increase. And so there's been substantial, really continuous growth, even during the recession in 2000, the 2007 to 2009 official recession. During that period of time, the overall tribal impacts actually grew in the state. So while other sectors were shrinking, overall the tribal impacts were actually growing. So they tend to be recession resilient. Which is really important in Idaho's rural economies. I found that just absolutely fascinating, you know. And again, in sales transaction today, the current estimate is 1.1 billion. In charitable donations, the 5 tribes of Idaho donated about $2.15 million to Idaho's charities and schools in 2014, and a similar magnitude of numbers donated every year. So they make important contributions to Idaho's charities and schools. Any questions? Yes.
You just said, I think on your last slide, that the tribes were recession resilient. Can you explain why you think that is?
Several reasons. One is a good portion of their funds comes from the federal government, and typically that funding there's a leveling process in that funding. So a lot of their operations are from federal funding, but also a lot of their some of their activity, a substantial portion of their activity is in agriculture, which tended to be portions of that industry were resilient. Many of their enterprises are growing at the same time, and they slowed down. Particularly the hospitality industry took a hit during this period of time, but they have bounced since that time, largely bounced back. So I would say it's the diversity of their activities that brings that stability. There is a whole array of new activities. Many of the tribes are exploring in investing or creating industrial parks and high technology parks, in addition to everything else they do. So I mean, they're installing high-speed internet. So all of these activities are kind of a long-term trajectory on a lot of their activities, and that itself makes it resistant to downturns. Yes?
Can you repeat what you said about taxes and activities that take place on tribal lands? Did you say that there were some activities that were exempt, or
yeah.
all activities were exempt?
If I understand correctly, if a tribal member, let's say, has a house that's on tribal land, it's exempt from property taxes. And if they work on the tribe and live on the tribe, I think they're exempt from income taxes, state income taxes. They're not exempt from federal taxes. And by the way, it sounds like it'd be a lot of money, but it really isn't. If you look at the historic configuration, most of the tribes sit right next to large communities that are not on the reservation. And a huge amount of that activity goes into those communities that are not tax exempt. So it's actually, when I actually got down and started drilling down, the, what really is these exemptions? What's the magnitude of them? Because I had to do that to estimate my tax impacts. Found out that it actually is really small.
So the casino activity, that's all taxable and taxed?
The casinos wouldn't be. It's on reservation land. But they're not. But all of the community spending is. And the downstream effects are all taxed. Right? So if you buy supplies from Lewiston, that's taxed. Right? It has to be on the reservation itself. So in the casinos, it's only the first leg that's untaxed. As it ripples, as those impacts ripple through the economy, then it is all of the downstream effects are all taxed.
There's state employment taxes as well. Huh?
Yeah.
For employees.
Yeah.
And that's taxable in the casinos?
Yes. Yeah.
How about the fuel taxes? Does the tribe collect the federal tax but not the state tax? Is that
I think that's correct. Is that? Oh.
Gasoline and diesel?
No federal taxes.
Okay.
No.
Well, the tribes, some of the tribes have agreements with the state where they collect equivalent sales fuels taxes and use the taxes for similar purposes that the state uses.
Transportation or road improvements.
Another compromise mentioned in the tribes would have to do that.
Yeah. Yes?
With this increase in employment of 80%, is there a concomitant decrease in unemployment in tribal numbers?
The tribal, the last I checked on tribal unemployment numbers, they had dramatically decreased. Yes, there has been a dramatic decrease. Some of those numbers are hard to obtain, but unemployment numbers tend to be squishy in any case. Underemployment is a big issue when you start calculating official employment numbers. But the numbers that I saw showed a dramatic decline in unemployment, sometimes to zero, officially. Yeah. Yes?
You noted the big increase in activity between your two studies, and I was wondering what sectors stood out as propelling that growth between 2001 and 2015?
The growth in federal government spending was part of it, but that mostly went to environmental restoration activities, new upgraded fisheries, another environmental mitigation. There's been an expansion of tribal enterprises across the state, and the casino industries, at least in the early part of the last decade, were also increasing rapidly. So most of the activity, most of this was from basically all segments of the tribe. Yes?
What other social trends have you seen, if you look, like population growth, levels of education, poverty levels, other sorts of measures?
In terms of?
In the same time period, so from 2001 to 2014, did you look at those other social measures?
I have not. Some of the social indicators are fairly complex, and I've kind of limited my scope to the economics of that. What I found about working on tribal issues is they're enormously complex. Whether you're talking about the history or the culture or the social economic factors. And so my focus is, I purposely held my focus to develop as thorough of an expertise on the impacts of it, and focused on that. So in terms of the social demographics, I wouldn't feel comfortable commenting on that, so, yes.
I'm wondering if you've done any modeling on the number of times a dollar bounces within the tribal economy before it leaves, or when you're using your in-plan model, are you just doing a really broad stroke, how it impacts other industries?
I've taken a really close look at how much the dollar stays within the tribal economy, and given the historic
Outflow?
Yeah, the historic configuration where, I don't think it's by accident, by the way, where it is the non-tribal community that benefits most from the tribal activities, and that's clearly the case, So you got to ask the question, when a dollar spent, for example, at Lapway or at Fort Hall, how much of that stays? Very little. So there's very little multiplier effect on the reservations themselves. Almost all of it goes to the surrounding communities. The Coeur d'Alenes and the Kootenays probably have the biggest multiplier effects because they have the most plumbers, a fairly integrated economy, and certainly Bonners Ferry is. But Lapway and Fort Hall, they need businesses to soak up that spending. And unfortunately, it's leaking to Lewiston in the case of the Nez Perce Tribe, and leaking to Pocatello. So in terms of economic development, one of the strategies would be to build those peripheral businesses to soak up those impacts. But it's hard. It's hard in these when you're starting from scratch with nothing there to hold that money in place. It is hard to do that. Yes.
Congratulations. I think it's very insightful, and your collaboration with the tribe. This is extremely important information. I really applaud you putting
Thank you.
together.
Thank you.
I have a question, but I have to formulate it as I speak it.
Yeah.
This is really an important pamphlet and information, and you were asked to assist in creating it for reasons from the tribes.
Yeah.
how can this information impact how we, Idaho politicians, decision makers, interact with the tribes in a more effective way? What's going to be hopefully the outcome of this good research?
I do a lot of these kinds of studies, and I'll give you kind of an analogy here. I work with the Idaho Nonprofit Center, and I did an impact on all Idaho nonprofits. And they took me on a dog and pony show one day through the legislature, in which I met every legislative leader in the state. Talk about an experience, right, in one day. So I'm presenting these impacts about the importance of nonprofits, and it was very interesting. Those politicians who understood the importance of nonprofits, then we talked about all the great things that nonprofits did. We didn't talk about impacts at all. For those legislators that didn't understand the importance of nonprofits, then we talked jobs and income. And the numbers were big enough they couldn't ignore. And I see that same strategy with the tribes. You know, if the tribes are doing just all of these great, wonderful things, but if the policymakers don't understand that, you can come back and hit them with things they do understand, and that is jobs, income, gross state product, and taxes. And so I think that's one of the areas that this can be used is for that. I think it shows both, but it shows more of the latter than the former, I think. So. Yeah.
To follow up on Rodney's question,
Yeah.
are there lessons from the tribes for other rural communities in Idaho? In other words, are these 5 tribes doing certain things well that a non-tribal community might try and emulate through job creation and economic development?
That's a complex question. Yeah.
Short of a casino in non-tribal communities, are there some of the enterprises that they seem to have hit a niche or found an audience that perhaps others could follow?
It's rural economic development is difficult in any case, and there's no magic bullet for any of this stuff, and it's often hit and miss. But I would say they are doing a good job in providing some key infrastructure, particularly high-speed internet. In fact, I was up in North Idaho, and some friends, the high-speed internet's going right by their rural house, and they'll be able to hook right up to it. They are working to promote local entrepreneurs, although that's hit and miss, but in almost every area, everything from small retail trade services to, I know there's been some talk about trying to develop some small-scale agriculture projects, both in the Shoshone-Bannock and the Nez Perce tribe. Try to prove there is efforts to explore, small-scale technology parks. Also, to try to, in cases where there's an intersection of the tribes and the rural areas, I think there's a lot of great partnership opportunities. And I think one of the things that I think there could be greater work both on the tribe's part and on local communities is working together. Unfortunately, there's this long history of ignorance, particularly in some of these local communities, and I have suggested many times, well, why don't you partner with the tribe? And the thought has just never occurred to them. I said, they're 5 miles away. Why haven't you thought about that?
Speaking of thoughts that might occur to them, have the tribes expressed any interest in augmenting this with an expression of added value in terms of ecosystem and social services? In a way, I'm asking, part of the question Dr. Finns was asking about what are the effects of this on social qualities and values, but on the environmental and ecosystem side, the tie between the tribes and the natural world is profound and fundamental. Have they expressed any desire for you to partner with others, cross-discipline on this, and estimate those added values?
I haven't heard, but I'd certainly be very interested in that. no, very much so, yeah,
Pursue.
yeah. Yeah, no, very much so.
It's a much more complex
Yeah.
story of their value.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a lot where some of the real value is, quite frankly. You know, again, the impacts are really for people who don't get the rest of the stuff, right? And I think building off of that is very important. So now I'd be very interested in that, and working with you on that. Yes.
When it comes to enterprise, are any of the tribes collaborating on any of it, or are they all separate entities?
That's a good question. The tribes, I think in terms of strategic goals, they collaborate pretty well. As far as individual enterprises, I'd have to think about that, and I'd have to do some checking as far as individual enterprise collaborations. I know in terms of working together in a statewide strategic way, they do so. They do so, I think, very well. But as far as specific tribal collaborations, I mean, specific enterprise collaborations, I'd have to think about that. Yeah. I'd have to check. Yeah. Yes?
Thank you. I think your project, or this whole 23 years, I mean, it speaks about a long vision and a long partnership between you and the tribes. Otherwise, it wouldn't be sustained. Have you, in looking at economic impact, I mean, have you been looking at the whole decision-making process within the tribes? And could that be the thing that could be also, you know, learned from or lessons for others? Because there's always this kind of focus on doing things, so, you know, that's connected with a worldview, or not only for this moment or for this particular project, but for the long run. Have you made any of those connections?
In terms of tribal decision making, I more or less leave that to them. You know, I mean, and I work very hard to be very collaborative, and you know, I take a very relaxed approach. I take a collaborative approach, but I try to leave their decision making to them and try to help them any way that I can. I guess because that's an entirely different area of, I think, of analysis as well. So that's my short answer for. Yeah. Yes.
The 1.1 billion in sales. My question is this gross or net? Does this take into account the alternative use of those funds? You know, had funding not been given to tribes, how those funds would have been spent otherwise?
Yes. Yeah. Essentially, it would have gone elsewhere outside of Idaho. Yeah. And I mean, any way you slice this up, that's new money to Idaho. So this isn't money that's swishing around inside. This represents net economic impacts to the state. And gross state product, if the tribes were just to disappear, the gross state product would shrink just under $700 million a year, enough to put Idaho in a recession. Let alone their local communities. It'd put some of them in a depression. Yeah.
I would invite all of you to stick around afterwards and continue the conversation among yourselves and with our speaker. Thank you for the excellent feedback and dialogue. I think that's what makes these colloquia so interesting, is the opportunity to interact with our speakers. I would invite you to return next Tuesday, September 8th, for our presentation on the everyday lives of extraordinary divas. But let's thank today's speaker for his time and expertise.